Hey, for today's edition of Thursday Thoughts, I wanted to take us back to Ecclesiastes. I personally haven't been in Ecclesiastes for a very long time, but it was the first series, the first book that I ever went through sequentially as a series. As a first year seminary student, it was very foolish of me. I should have chosen an easier book like Philippians or something. Ecclesiastes is very hairy, and it tends to be oversimplified by people to just mean, oh, the world sucks. You should follow God. That's, to be fair, kind of works, but it really misses the nuance of what Solomon is trying to say through this book. Specifically, I want to look at chapter 4, verses 4 through 12. And the reason why I wanted to take us here for today is because I've been kind of thinking about the cyclical, very mundane nature of life nowadays. Things aren't very fresh anymore. Now that we're, I think, 6 or 7, maybe 8 weeks into shelter in place, things get kind of boring. And I think when you're bored is actually a great time to consider Ecclesiastes, specifically because this book meditates on the cyclical and mundane nature of life, and it uses this word vanity or meaningless, whatever translation you're using. It uses this word to express the feeling and the reality of this world and life that we live. And I wanted to choose this passage in particular because I wanted to think about work together. Because all of us work, whether you're an adult or a student or something else, you have work to do. And Ecclesiastes was very formative in my own conception of what work is, even my theology of work, because I think Solomon provides us really great wisdom on this. So let's look at chapter 4, verses 4 through 12. So Solomon writes this: "Then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and is striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after wind. Again, I saw another vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, 'For whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure?' This also is vanity and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because if they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to help lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they can keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken." Now, this passage helps us reflect on the idea of work, specifically different motivations for work, and also wise limits to place on work. The author assumes that you want to be a happy person. The author assumes that you want to be joyful. And this is a really useful meditation on work to help you maintain a joyful attitude about work. Because in the grand scheme of things, you don't need to be an inspired biblical author to know that work isn't the most important thing in life. Because at the end of the day, when you die, you don't take your work with you. But it does take an inspired biblical author to tell you, well, how can you be joyful before God, living in relationship with Him as you consider work? So let's talk about different motivations for work first. In verse 4, the author brings up envy as a prime motivation for work. And this is vanity, this is meaningless, because if envy is what drives you to work hard, you'll never be satisfied, because there's always going to be someone richer, someone more prominent, someone in a better position. Michael Bloomberg is not number 1, and he may not be for his lifetime. If you were number 1 in the world, you'll always have more money to make in order to stay number 1 in the world. That's just the nature of envy. It's insatiable. So Solomon points out, look, if envy drives your work, if it's that sort of competition where you just need to be better, then you will never be joyful in your work. And I think that's very wise of Solomon to write. And then in verse 7, we find a very interesting perspective. It's working for no one, right? On the one hand, you're working out of envy when you're envying other people. So in that sense, you're kind of being driven by other people. But in verse 7, this person who works so hard, this picture that Solomon paints of a person who is alone and works for no one but himself, he's in a bad place too, because Solomon points out there's no one to share things with. There's no one to share good with. This fictional character in verses 7 and 8 is someone who spends their life whittling away at their work day after day, accruing things, gaining things, but never having anyone to share with. And Solomon points out that that's vanity too. And that's an interesting perspective for us to have, that there is a necessary companionship and a relational component to the human life, such that if you were to take the idea that work is the most important thing to the point that you would neglect all the relationships that you could be enjoying, you will actually never enjoy your work. Now, this person that's portrayed here is kind of an extreme example because he has neither brother nor son. That is to say that he has no family relations. That's sort of a roundabout way of saying that. In our situation today, you might think, well, I do have a family and I do work to support them, but I would take the liberty of pushing this idea one step further in order to say, what if we allow our work to keep us from enjoying those relationships that we have? What if we use the excuse of work to distance ourselves from the humans that God has put in our lives to enjoy and to cherish? As much as we might say that we work for these other people, these other close relationships, what if we're working to the point that we don't actually enjoy them? Just because you have a relationship doesn't mean you're enjoying that relationship. And Solomon is suggesting that that will bar you from truly enjoying work, and because of that, truly enjoying life as well. And then in verses 5 through 6, Solomon wants to suggest a healthy limit on work. And he gives two poles, two opposite possibilities. The first is a fool. A fool is someone who is just lazy and doesn't work. He eats his own hands because he's got nothing else to eat. But on the other hand, he tells us it's better to have a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after the wind. Now that's a very interesting idea, and I want to unpack this a little bit. It's the idea that rest is actually important. That if you don't rest, if you don't give yourself space away from toil, away from work, it will actually, again, detract from your joy in the process of working. The idea is that if you have one handful of rest, you can't be burning the candle at both ends, so to speak. One handful of rest means you only have one other hand for work. Whereas the other option that he's portraying here is to have both hands full of work, that you're so busy in this vain pursuit that you have no time for rest. And what Solomon wants to remind us is that that is a vanity and a striving after wind. That is to say, all that work without rest will amount for nothing. So it makes sense in Solomon's mind, and I would suggest it should make sense for all of us, that it's wise to have rest. It's wise to take a step back from work and actually enjoy the good things in life, like nature or your family, good food, good things to drink, whatever it is. So with all that said, take stock of your work. Take a step back, consider your life, think about ways that you can be more joyful as you continue to do the work that's necessary for your life.